Hello, welcome to the Self-Learning Podcast by Dr. Sushma Singh. Let us start discussion on Unit 12, Trends and Pattern of Urbanization. Units 1 to 4 have dealt with the concepts of urban sociology as well as urbanization and urban growth at macro level. This unit tries to define towns based on their size class distribution. It also attempts to analyze the trends and pattern of urbanization across size class of towns in the country and explain their development dynamics. It further attempts to describe the pattern of urbanization across states and size class of settlements. It also tries to underline the problems of calculating growth rates of urban centers and calculate the same by taking common towns in both the base and terminal years for the past 3 decades. Finally, it attempts to analyze the disparity in the growth across size class of urban centers and bring out the emerging pattern. This unit concludes with a summary of the main observations. Now let us move to the point census classification of urban settlements. The Indian census presents demographic data separately for rural and urban areas. The units of classification for urban areas are towns. In keeping with the age-old tradition of the Indian census, the urban units have been categorized into 6 population size classes by the census as size class 1, 1 lakh and above; class 2, 50,000 to 99,999; class 3, 20,000 to 49,999; class 4, 10,000 to 19,999; class 6, 5,000 to 9,999; and class 6 less than 5,000. The class 1 urban units are generally called cities. In other words, all urban agglomeration or towns with a population of 1 lakh and above are called cities. Urban agglomeration or cities with a population of a million and above are often referred to as million plus cities or metropolitan areas. Towns with a population ranging between 20,000 and 99,999, class 2 and 3, are called medium sized towns, and those smaller in size, classes 4, 5 and 6, are generally designated as small towns. The total number of towns in a district, state or country can be counted by 2 methods. Firstly, taking the urban agglomeration as more one unit, ignoring the number of towns and cities constituting the agglomeration. And secondly, taking each constituent town or city separately within the urban agglomeration. In the former, the total numbers of towns are much less, since many towns are part of urban agglomerations. and other inclusion as units in the UA reduces the number of towns in the final summation. For example, in 1991 census reports the total number of towns as 4,689, whereas the total number of UA and cities or towns are reported as much less than 3,768. Now let us move to the next point, trends and pattern of urbanization in India across size class of urban settlements. It may be noted that 2001 census reported a total of 5,161 towns, which is 1,000 more than 1981. The 1991 census reported 3,768 urban agglomerations and towns and 4,689 towns as noted above. The 2001 census reported 68.67% of the urban population in class 1 cities with a population above 1 lakh. There are 35 cities or agglomerations each with a population of 10 lakh and above. These cities are also called million plus cities and they constitute about the 38% of the country's urban population with a total population of 108 million. The process of urbanization in India is largely large city oriented. This pattern is evident at the national level as well as in most of the states. Importantly, the share of the class 1 cities has been going up systematically in all the decades in the last century. The present section focuses on the analysis of the changing structure of urban population across size class of settlements over the decades, especially after independence. The growing top heaviness has been examined in the context of shifting of urban center across size class of urban centers. Explanation of the changing settlement structure has been sought in terms of differential demographic growth of urban centers in different size classes. Class 1 cities dominates the urban structure of the country. This share, though very high, was still comparable to the smaller towns. In 1901, the share of class 1 cities was 26%, whereas the class 4 and class 5 towns contributed 20.83 and 20.14% of the urban population. The share of class 1 cities since then increased. The recorded a significant increase during 1931 to 41, a decade before the partition of the country. At the time of independence, a large proportion of displaced persons were absorbed in the large towns, resulting in an increase of the share of urban population to 44.63% in 1951 from 38.23% in the previous decade. This increase of about 7 percent points of the share of population of the class 1 cities was maintained in next 2 decades as well. Increment in percentage share of population in these cities has been about 3 percent points since the 1970s. This has been maintained till the 90s as well as when the percentage share of population was reported to be 68.67 as compared to 64.89 in 1991. The share of population in class 4, 5 and 6 towns maintained a steady decline during 1901 to 2001. Their combined share declined from 47% in 1901 to about 7% in 2001. The percentage share of population in medium-sized town, class 2 and class 4 towns have remained by and large stable over the century. Their share have fluctuated between 11 and 13% respectively. The tremendous increase in the share of class 1 cities may be attributed to the faster growth of these towns as well as increase in the number of towns as they graduate from lower order towns. In 1901, there were only 24 towns in this category. This figure increased to 393 in 2001. This can be attributed to natural increase in population as also migration to large towns, which together result in increase in population of towns below 1 lakh, enabling these to cross this cutoff point. Significantly, the general perception among planners, administrators, statisticians and academicians in the country is that larger urban centers in the country are growing at a higher rate in comparison to the small and medium towns. The population census computes the growth rate of towns in a size class by considering the population belonging to a particular size class in the initial as well as terminal years, without taking note of the generally upward movement of the urban centers. As a consequence, the growth rate of class 1 cities work out to be very high, since this is the category which over the time gains in the number of cities. On the other hand, those lower order size categories that lose in the number of towns because of the upward graduation of towns generally show a low growth rate. Indeed, the small towns, class 5 and class 6 at times show negative growth rate, not because those towns are facing depopulation, but because of the fact that many of them graduate to higher order towns. In view of the problems of compatibility, scholars have proposed that for computing the growth rate, the base year classification of urban centers should be maintained, both for base as well as terminal years. This would imply that the population of only those towns that belong to a particular category in the base year should be added up in the terminal year as well. This would make the number of towns at both the time points the same for each category in computing their growth rate. Fortunately, the 1991 census has given population of common towns in Appendix 10 of the provisional population tables. This information is extremely useful in comparing the growth rate across size classes. It may, however, be noted that all new towns get excluded from this calculation, since the base year category constitutes the basis for the classification of towns. Moreover, even the towns declassified in the terminal year get excluded. This might be responsible for an upward bias in the growth estimates in small towns. of class 6 and 5th, as these would claim most of the declassified towns. It has been mentioned above that the class 1 cities have experienced growth rates that are more than that of smaller towns in most of the states. However, in many states, class 6 towns with population below 5,000 have registered phenomenal growth. This is due to the special status accorded to these settlements and corresponding high public sector investment in them. It may be noted that many among the class 6 towns have been established or are managed by government departments, public agencies, military establishments, or private industries. A section of scholars have argued that the Indian urban structure reflects no distortion and a stable morphology, as the population growth is more or less uniform across the size classes. It is, however, evident that this is not the case. Urban centers in the class 1 categories are growing at a higher rate than the smaller towns. This was evident in 1981 census, except for the class 6 towns. Indeed, the class 6 towns show higher growth rates. This is because these towns show different development dynamics, as most of these belong to a special category of industrial townships, pilgrimage centers, or settlements through establishment of a public sector industry in greenfield locations, as mentioned above. Now let us wind up the session and take rest. Thank you very much for engaging yourself with the self-learning podcast.